days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. My name is Scott Daly, and I am currently fleeing across the desert.
And my name is Matt Freeman, and I'm following him.
That's right, Matt. Stick close behind because it's going to be a wild ride. The journey has begun officially, and I'm so very excited and a little nervous, Matt. This is a big day for us. We've been planning the show for a while, and it's here, and we're doing it now, and it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's got that new show smell in here.
Yeah, it does. Today, we're going to be discussing Chapter 1 of The Gunslinger.
Wait.
Huh.
Stop. We've done this already.
What?
This whole thing, we've done this before.
But that would mean it's some sort of loop.
Oh my God.
I just looked into my camera and then I remembered that people couldn't see us. And so that really wasn't a good way to end the skit. But hello, everyone. We fooled you. We're back. We never left. We are here. We thought it would be a really fun idea of coming back for kind of an encore the week after our final episode and doing what The Dark Tower does, which is take another look at the first book in the series, The Gunslinger. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I want to stress here, Matt, for you and for everyone listening at home, we are not going to go through all the books in the Dark Tower again. Like, this is not going to be a series. This is a one-off encore, I think is a great way of describing it, where we're just going to spend an hour or so talking about what it was like rereading the Dark Tower at the very, very end of this project. Or sorry, reading The Gunslinger, not the Dark Tower, rereading The Gunslinger and only The Gunslinger at the very, very end of this project. So that's what we're going to be doing today.
That's right. I verify that we're not gonna fool you twice. This is it.
Yeah, nobody. I don't want anyone on Thursday next week to be like, "Oh, I can't wait for the drawing of the 3 episode." No, please. We're being very serious right now. That is not happening. This is truly the final episode. I promise you.
And there's something about the Gunslinger in particular, I think, that really bears revisiting after going through the Dark Tower and having a lot more context on who King is. Like, I think we can have just a wildly different conversation than we had the first time around. So that's a good reason to do this.
I agree. I mean, I think my perspective on this book has changed at the end of this whole journey, but I think yours probably has changed quite a bit because, we're just experiencing everything the first time. I think we also, one thing I wanted to spend a little bit of time on today, not a huge amount, but a little bit of time, is the differences between the re-released 2003 version of the book and the original published edition of the book, because King did, as he was kind of ramping up for the finale of the Dark Tower, go back to the Gunslinger and rewrote a little bit. We talked about this when we covered it the first time, but we had only read this newly published version, and it includes a lot of things. It peppers a lot of things in here for what King does later on. And so I have read the original Gunslinger. I have it right here. Like, this is the original unedited version. I have read it. I'm not going to do like a side-by-side comparison, because if you want that, you can literally just Google it, and people have done a full suite, like, word by word comparison of where he changed everything in this book. But I think it's worth talking about a little bit about the differences, like, broadly, and what they do to the perception of the novel. I think the things that are laying seeds for the way the series ends up going in the future are things that you probably picked up on more on your second read, third read, or whatever number of read you're in on the Gunslinger now. Because they're not actually subtle at all. They're very like, it's a type of thing that it cleverly hides itself to where you reading the first time just won't pick up on it at all. But upon reread, you're like, oh yeah, like, these are very obvious gestures towards what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's still valuable to go into it in a little bit of detail, because there's got to be some indications of, where he changed his mind explicitly versus where he knew vaguely where he was going and just kind of left it as it was, versus where he just inserted some reference, like all the 19 stuff. That's all added later, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
There is no 19 reference in the original version of the book. That is all added in. The same thing with the Manny and the Tahine that he sees in the desert. That's all stuff that's added in. One of the most interesting changes to me was in the chapter The Slow Mutants, Roland is dreaming about Susan, and he's dreaming about Susan's death. That him dreaming about Susan's death is still in the original version of the book. Only in the dream, he is being held back by two people watching her burn, and has like an iron collar around his neck as if he's been arrested and forced to watch this happen. That's, of course, we know after reading Wizard and Glass, not the way it happened. Roland was not even present when Susan was set on fire. But it's so funny that he wrote that scene originally in the first book, changed his mind on how he wanted Susan's death to go, and then when he went back and updated the Gunslinger, he didn't change that scene. He just simply like put a note that was like, he knew this wasn't the way it actually went, but that's dream magic. Like it's such a funny choice to do that, right? Because he could have just rewritten the scene and just had Susan's death play it differently and have him like desperately rushing towards her, trying to get back in town, essentially the same way it plays in Wizard and Glass, and he didn't do that.
I think it's interesting. He's trying to sort of honor what he did in the past while also making it line up a little bit better. I think it is interesting, of course, that he did always have this idea that Roland had a beloved named Susan who died. That was there from the beginning.
Cuthbert and Elaine were there from the beginning as well. I think that the stuff with the tarot cards and the future characters was there as well. It's fleshed out a little bit more, but that central concept was there as well. It is surprising how much of what will become the Dark Tower is present in the original version of this book.
Yeah. So he definitely had some conception of where he was heading, but then he changed his mind about a lot of the details, probably to keep it fresh for himself, as we've talked about before. I think it's important to him that he not feel locked into any particular choice, because that choice might not feel organic in the moment. So he definitely changes things.
I want to so this book overall is a very interesting book, and we talked about this a little bit last week. But just this general idea that this book is not really written in what you would typically call Stephen King's voice. It is a very differently written kind of book. It's a very tonally different kind of book. It is, in fact, arguably a really rough entry point for a series that becomes something dramatically different even on the second book. You noticed this very distinctly when you moved on to Drawing of the Three for the first time. What I find really interesting about this, and kind of the linking of this conversation, is I was trying to decide. There's a lot of purists out there that say you should only read the original version of The Gunslinger. You should not be reading this new version, which is easier said than done because it's not published anymore. So like you only have to find like original copies. Like I have this used copy I have here. But I there's something I noticed while reading it this time, and maybe maybe this is all in my head. I'm curious what you think. The things that are additions, that are stuff like the 19, that are stuff like, he adds the skeletons of Billy Bumblers to the Golgotha instead of just all the other animals there. Like those stuff really stuck out to me this time in a way that they never had before, in a way that for the first time in my life, I've kind of felt like, oh, this is a guy who with a different authorial voice now coming back and trying to imitate his previous style. And I found that really weird and off-putting at times. What do you think? Am I going crazy here?
I mean, it's hard to know because, like you say, our attention is finely tuned to notice what shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I do feel like you're right. Like the tone, the style of this book is very spare, and he's really doing something different. It really has this distinct, just dry Western tone. It's funny. I don't think this is just recency bias, but it kind of reminds me of the Dashiell Hammett's the Maltese Falcon that we just read for book club just last month, because like that was a book that was just very spare on the description of people's feelings. It was very kind of objective. Now there's a lot of places where that doesn't line up with this, because this book can actually be very detailed and descriptive. Like there's a lot of descriptive writing and like almost I think the first time we went around this wheel, I compared it to Blood Meridian, actually,
Yeah,
and
I think that's
Cormac
true.
McCarthy, in the specific sense of like it's a Western, and also it's this like very elevated descriptive style. He's not doing the same thing as Cormac McCarthy, really, because McCarthy is just doing something totally different with that book. But like,
Yeah.
what I mean though is, we spend a lot of time focusing on the grandiosity of everything, and that's just really not something present in the rest of the Dark Tower.
Yeah. I find this really interesting because it does, like, all these books are different, right? Like every Dark Tower book is different. It's trying to do a different thing. It's playing in a different genre. But I think that something that is absolutely true for books 2 through 7 they are all definitely written in Stephen King's voice. Like, he had, by the time he's writing Drawing of the Three, he's kind of got an understanding of who he is as an author, the way he wants to write books, the tone and the rhythm and the pace and the voice of his books. And that's just not present in this book. And I love this book, I really do. And every read has only strengthened my love for this book. It's weird and wonderful and different. But I think I had a realization reading this book this time, which was that I don't love the Dark Tower because I love the Gunslinger. I love the Gunslinger because I love the Dark Tower as a series. And I think that's actually a really important distinction. And it makes it a really interesting, like, kind of unique book in this whole thing. So I guess what was your experience rereading it? How do you feel about it?
So the funny thing is, I think, like you kind of indicated a minute ago, this is the third time I've actually listened to The Gunslinger, because I listened to it again after we finished the project, the original season.
Mm-hmm.
And then I listened to it again over the last few weeks in preparation for this conversation. And it's grown on me quite a lot is the short answer. I like it more and more each time I listen to it, which I think surprises me on some level, because I had absorbed this idea of like, yeah, The Gunslinger is kind of a rough, weird novel. It's a rough start to the Dark Tower series. But as I think we talked recently about the benefits of rereading, and the benefit of rereading The Gunslinger in particular is that, like, what you're getting into, and you're just able to let it wash over you. And it's a book that really benefits from that sort of approach, where you're not really hung up on the question, for example, of like, is Roland gonna actually sacrifice this kid? You already know he's gonna do that. There's no real tension there. So you're watching the evolution, and you're feeling the doomed fate weighing on this guy, and you can appreciate different things. There's also that's one thing. There's another thing, which is like the scene where he challenges Court for his guns.
Yes, that
was a scene where I feel like maybe the first time we read that scene, it was like, I was basically like, yeah, that's cool. That's a cool scene. And this time, like, it takes on this totemic importance when you reread it, especially after having reread the whole series, because you're like, this is Roland challenging Court for his guns and the sacrifice of David. It's the metaphor. Do you understand?
Yeah.
And it's like all of that barely registered really the first time, and then you come back around to it, and it feels like you're reading a Bible story or something, because you understand what a pivotal moment it is in the life of this character,
right?
And also kind of all of the metaphor that is latent there just pops out to you, because you see how these themes recur and evolve throughout the series. It's kind of like that scene is almost just a metaphor for the whole Dark Tower, in so many ways.
No, so, I think you're right, because sorry to interject, but it's just like, we correctly picked up on the metaphor the first time we read the book. You correctly picked up on the metaphor the first time you read the book, kind of because King explains the metaphor for you, because the scene immediately after that is Roland going to Jake, so do you understand the point of my story? And Jake's like incredulous. And he's like, what do you mean, do I understand? Yeah, I get it. I'm a
Uh-huh.
poker chip to you. I fucking get it. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying here is not necessarily that did we pick up on the metaphor of David being Roland's first sacrifice. Of course we did. But to your point, we didn't, or I guess you didn't because you hadn't read the rest of the series, fully absorb the totemic, mythic, I think biblical importance of that as essentially Roland's original sin, right? This is the biting the apple of Roland. This is
Yeah.
the first time he did it. And the line that I loved reading it this time that I don't think I've ever appreciated as much as I had was when, Court is wounded on the floor after being defeated, and he says, "How did you train him?" And Roland's response is perfect and cruel. And Roland, he says, "I never trained him. I friended him." And that's fucking Roland. Like
Yeah.
that is, this is not only does he use people as if they are pawns or chips or things to sacrifice for his ultimate goal, but he brings them under his protection. Like he brings them in his world, he befriends them, he makes them fall in love with him, and then does this. And the mythological power of that is just
Yeah.
absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah. So there's all of that. There's also just relatedly, Cuthbert and Ellen are two characters who, in this book, they are firmly in the background.
Yeah.
He's just remembering his childhood, and really, Ellen is barely there. Cuthbert is much more there, but even he, he's not. He's an element in Roland's story. You don't get a real sense of him, but then you go ahead and you read the rest of the series, and then now suddenly you are faced with, oh, this is Cuthbert. It's Cuthbert. It's his dear friend Cuthbert, and so that's another thing that just lands differently on a reread. It's to be meta. I mean, I think this whole conversation is meta. So just to be particularly meta, though, like I think part of the reason why King decided to write The Dark Tower with the ending that he did is because he actually appreciates the power of rereading, and how like rereading is its own pleasure. Going back through a story more than once is a different kind of experience than just reading it the first time. And so he wrote the book so that you could sort of enjoy it on an extra level, because like this character is sort of going through the book again with you. Yes, he's forgotten everything. That's true, but metaphysically, this is his purgatory. You read the book with him once. Now you're reading the book a second time with Roland, and Roland is on whatever loop you're on. That's like that's the great part.
Yeah, perpetually on whatever loop you're on. Yeah, I mean, regardless of whether he has the horn or not, or which obviously the horn references were something that was changed as well. Like Roland several times says, "Oh, that horn that I didn't pick up." Yeah, why did I suddenly think about that horn? And that's King having fun with us a little bit. But I mean, I agree with that. I think you're right. That just kind of the fun in his head of getting to go back and reading The Gunslinger the first time after finishing the series is going to be this illuminating new thing to you. I felt I was really, so the part of the book I like spent the most time thinking about was the first chapter, actually, which kind of surprised me, because I just feel like the book like goes into high gear when Jake comes along, and when suddenly we're forced with Roland, like the way he immediately falls in love with this boy, and you can see, like, even before the book starts laying the seeds of the trap, you can kind of see it forming just perfectly, that this is this kid that is just going to immediately be enrapturing by Roland. But the first chapter is, I know I'm going to repeat myself of what we said the first time we covered this, but the kind of nested story structure of the way King chooses to open this whole thing will just never not be fascinating to me, where we just have Roland begin, think back to remember his time with Brown, which causes it to think back to remember his time in Tull, And then even then we jump back again to remember Alice's time in Tull when the Man in Black first came, and we're just like so many levels deep on this thing, and it just it's just remarkably effective for such a young writer to like keep all this balanced and in mind, in a way that I think ultimately works really, really well for me. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've read this first chapter of this book, and it's still just enthralling the entire time. Just everything that goes down, how he describes the people of Tull, the interaction with Sylvia Pittston, still one of like the weirdest choices in books I've ever experienced, and yet it just plays out like perfectly. Like, I just don't even question it. I'm just like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Well, she ends up being sort of a perfect character to fit into the Dark Tower, and really a kind of perfect king archetype, where it's like this religious zealot who has kind of brainwashed the town, maybe supernaturally, maybe she's just really persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
Like her underlying nature is kind of unclear in a way that I like, actually. What I mean by that is like the idea that the whole town just throws themselves at him rapidly to the point where they're all killed. That's the kind of thing where you could believe that Sylvia Pittston has sort of, enthralled them magically, but also these are not normal people. so,
Mm-hmm.
so like maybe this is just their lives, and she was able to talk them into it easily. Anyway, it's a minor point, but yeah, I agree. Like the Gunslinger, the first chapter is probably my favorite part of the book. I will say on a reread, I think I like all of the parts more than I did the first time, because I see how it all connects together,
Mm-hmm.
and really everything sort of speaks to the themes in ways that are, surprising later. Like even the Oracle and the Mountain chapter is probably the one where the first time I read the book, you if you had asked me, I would have said that's the one that connects the least to the through line of the story. What do we really gain narratively from the fact that he has to talk to this oracle? Like what?
Mm-hmm.
And then in retrospect, it's like, well, King kind of goes out of his way in the later books to make that connect to things. And
Sure.
and you can see how it maybe connects thematically, even though it doesn't connect narratively. So that's one place where I think I really, in terms of where I changed my mind the most between first read and this read, I think it would be the Oracle part, because I frankly just saw it as like a weird, trippy, interlude of little narrative consequence the first time through.
Sure. I mean, I guess I was thinking about this because King does this thing where he has this Oracle interlude that basically kind of defines, here's what you're going to find. He basically introduces Eddie Dean. He introduces Susanna, and he introduces the Pusher.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes through the tarot deck with the Man in Black, who also essentially does the same thing. And I do find it interesting that we choose, and King chooses to do that kind of repetition here,
Yeah.
where we have two instances in the same book where someone is reading Roland his fortune and laying out his plan for us. And like a non-charitable read of this is it's just repetitive and you shouldn't have done it. But I think a more charitable and doof-esque read of this is what King is really trying to do is enforce immediately and often kind of the way fate not only dictates how the story is going to play out generally through the concept of Ka, but also just how Roland himself is kind of a slave to his understanding of what his destiny, of what his fate is. Because the interesting thing about the Oracle section of the book is there is no reason why Roland did it. So just to refresh everyone, what happened in this part of the book is they finally get out of the desert. They're resting in a green forest area for the first time. Roland wakes up in the middle of the night after rolling over in his nightmare and like putting his hand in a fire, which is a great metaphor for you there.
Uh-huh.
and he finds Jake has kind of been in his sleep summoned to this oracle sex demon that is having her way with him. He rescues Jake from this place. He realizes that the jaw is like a way of resisting the pull of this demon, and he gets Jake back, ties Jake up. Wake up next morning, Roland's like, all right, Jake, I'm going to leave you here alone. If you feel the pull of the succubus, grab this jaw. I got some business to take care of. He grabs some mezcal, gets high, and then goes to confront the demon.
Uh-huh.
Why? Not because the demon needs killing or it represents this clear and present threat to me and Jake, but simply because he gets the feeling when he's in there that it's an oracle, and he needs someone to tell him what to do next.
Yeah.
And like, that is like, this is so important. Like, ultimately that's why he gets to the Man in Black. That's why, like, and that he is a continual, and I think this is a perfect kind of overarching discussion on Ka fate. This idea of it is this real force that exists in this world that are dictating stuff. I still love your kind of original theory at the end of the whole thing, which is that it's storytelling, but it's also a thing that Roland willingly enslaves himself to, because he is constantly asking, what's my fate? What's supposed to happen? What is my Ka? I'm going to ask questions. I want people to tell me. Flip over those cards. Tell me what it means. What does it mean? What does that card mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? And he's just so enslaved to it.
Yeah. This is, I'm glad you brought this up. This is an element that is a million times clearer on the reread, that indeed the whole reason why he's following the Man in Black, like, we don't, as we're reading the book the first time, I think we maybe assume that he's chasing the Man in Black so that he can bring him to justice. Like, that's kind of the trope.
Mm-hmm.
The tropey idea is the gunslinger is the lawman. He's chasing the Man in Black so that he can bring him to justice. Absolutely wrong. he just wants to, like, find something out from him, and the nature of the thing he wants to find out is unclear even to him.
Yeah.
The Man in Black gives him this tarot reading, like you said, which basically just repeats the same information that he got from the oracle, and furthermore doesn't really change any of his choices. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not really, when we get to drawing of the three, which is maybe outside of the purview of this conversation, but it's not like he really makes dramatically different choices because of what the oracle or the Man in Black told him. He goes to the beach. He opens the doors because the doors are there. Eddie's there. Odette is there. Jack Mort is there. And then he rejects Jack Mort, which is not even something the oracle or the Man in Black told him he could do.
Yeah.
So what was even the point of wanting to know his fate, right? And it's like, and there's also this kind of layer of irony over everything, where it's like, what he really wants to know from all of them is like, will I get to the tower?
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, it's like, I forget what the Man in Black says exactly, but like to me, on the emotional level, the vibe that I got was like, oh, he'll get to the tower, but it'll cost you everything and you'll regret it. So,
mm-hmm.
You
but
shouldn't
all he
get
hears
to the
is
tower.
like, oh, so I will get to the tower.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I love you brought this up. Just the fact that he's so constantly interested in the future. And then the book also goes out of its way to say he's not a man prone to thinking about the past. And this is actually unusual, that during the interludes of basically this book, kind of starting around the time that he meets Jake, I guess you could say, he starts thinking more and more about the past. And so it's like there's this man, kind of, you could say, obsessed with the future and the past, at least for this duration. And not really, like, clearly not making the right choices in the present, right?
Yeah.
Like, just, he feels dominated by who his past has made him into, and what he owes, sort of, his upbringing and his nature, and then what he's fated to do, which is in his mind sort of out of his control. And so it's like he's just sliding downhill, with the past being everything that came before and the future being everything ahead. And in the moment, he's just, of course I'm going to let the kid die because Ka, and because of the way I was brought up, and like he just totally surrenders his morality, right? Okay, and I know I'm kind of all over the place, but it was so interesting when Stephen Deshane is like, morality is going to always be beyond you. that was the thing that I think really hit me this time around, where it's like, yeah, correct.
His father pegs him perfectly. Yeah. I love everything you just said there. One thing that really spoke to me this time, speaking of Jake and this kind of inevitability of when in the moments leading up to Jake's death, I think this is when they're when Jake has basically jumped off the cart and said, I'm not going with you. I'm just going to stay here. And he's just like, okay. And he starts leaving. One of the things that happens, and I don't know, I never picked up on this before, but when he's like talking to Jake, he says like, fine, go. And what he remembers in that moment is when Martin like dismissively told him to go like find his hand. Which is this really interesting thing where he is in this moment, like knowingly putting himself in the character of the Man in Black at that moment. It's like this, and it's important to say because like the Man in Black being so dismissive and challenging to him in that moment is what forced him to rashly challenge Court and set him on this path, right? And so in this moment where he's basically giving Jake his final lie before he brings him to his doom, he puts himself in the position of Martin, of the Man in Black, and puts Jake in the position of himself. I don't know why I didn't pick up on that the first time. I don't remember specifically talking about that, but I found that incredibly fascinating. Like, This is one, I think the book does this really good job, and this is something that you don't need to reread for. This is something that is just so incredibly obvious from the jump, is that Roland, like, he's making the poor choice. Like, he's just continually making the poor choice, and he knows the choice is coming. The book is very transparent that like, you're going to go under the mountain with this kid, you're going to be asked to sacrifice the kid, and you're going to do it. And yeah, I think you're right that there's tension of whether he would actually end up doing that or not the first time we read the book. But like, what there is no tension about is that Roland is behaving horribly throughout all this. And I think stuff like comparing himself to the Man in Black or Martin in that instance is just a perfect way of King really making this clear to us that this is the wrong choice, the wrong decision. You're being a heartless monster, and everyone knows it. The kid knows it. You know it. Everyone knows it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up kind of Jake's perception of things, because this is another place where things land differently. After you read the whole series and you realize Jake is a character who comes back, you get to know Jake very, very well. You see their relationship change over time, obviously. Then it's very easy to slip into Jake's point of view during all these scenes, where maybe it wasn't necessarily so easy for me to slip into Jake's point of view the first time around, because you don't really know this kid, right? You get a sort of a brief glimpse into his interiority when he is being hypnotized. But that's fairly quick. But then later in the series, we spend a lot more time with Jake. So it's very easy to see like how horrible Roland is being from the perspective of Jake, and how he's going to think about this later. Like, that was one thing I was thinking about while reading it this time, is I was like, the Jake that we know and love from later in the series remembers this. He remembers Roland behaving this way and being a giant asshole and letting him fall. And yes, Roland, rectifies that mistake in a certain sense, but he still did this, and Jake still remembers this, and he kind of forgives him for it. But that's something that was very salient to me whenever Jake was in the story. I think part of it is like, maybe the first time through I saw Jake as like a younger, psychologically younger character. And and then reading it this time, I kind of had, Jake Chambers in my head, like the character who we come to understand,
Sure.
who is a very, very capable, um, deep steel type character. Um,
Sure.
and that kind of changed how I perceive some things.
Man, that one moment where I think it's like when they've just gone under the mountain, and Roland is like desperately trying to tell Jake the story about his past that Jake just won't hear at all. And then this really interesting thing happens that does not happen very often. Jake pretends to be asleep. Roland eventually falls asleep, and then Jake wakes up or stops pretending and just stares at sleeping Roland for a while,
Hmm.
which is like kind of sort of Jake getting the jump on Roland, right? Like Roland, this incredibly observant, best uber mensch, like Superman guy, like
Yeah.
he is the kid tricked him essentially, or got him to lower his defenses or whatever. And Jake just looks at Roland. I think the text describes this as this look of combined hatred and love, and
Yeah.
I just love that dynamic. I think that's such a wonderful thing that to lead you under the mountain in, is that like this is what Roland does. This is what he makes you fall in love with him. And by you, I mean the characters in the story and you and me, the readers of the story. He is this objectively terrible person that nonetheless makes you fall in love with him in many different ways, because you pity him in some ways, because he's a badass in other ways. Like, I think we said this during our initial run through, but it remains true on this reread. Stephen King is making a bet with you that he can construct a awful human being and then say, but you're gonna love him. and
Yeah.
and people do. Everyone does. Everyone loves Roland. And
Yeah.
yet we hate him. He drives us crazy. We're so frustrated by his choices, and that's how the characters feel too.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty hard to hate someone that you so fully understand.
Yeah.
Um, and that's one thing this book really does, is spend a lot of time making sure you understand him. We see so much of his past, and so much of the Dark Tower is flashbacks to Roland's past. But this book in particular, we spend so much time with him, either telling a story to Jake or just internally reminiscing, um, or sort of both at the same time. Like when he tells the story of how he won his guns, it's like he's telling the story to Jake, but the narrative takes on the voice of the past. Um,
Hmm.
the story of Hax the cook, and all these things. Um, we're really coming to understand where this guy comes from, why he is the way he is, why he sees the world this way, and it becomes, you becomes difficult to judge him.
Yeah.
So one element I always thought was interesting the first time around, and now maybe makes a little bit more sense, although maybe not 100%, is just the fact that Jake is a kid from Earth, and that was a choice that. So what I mean by that is, like, Roland the Gunslinger from this weird sci-fi Western pastiche is crossing the desert chasing a sorcerer, and he comes to a way station, and there's a kid there. Is it some kid from Midworld? It could have been.
Hmm.
We could have written the story that way, where it was
Yeah.
just some kid from Midworld who had a life maybe kind of similar to Roland's in some ways, but no, it's a kid from New York City. Why? and, and I think part of it is because that connects to us more. That gives us more of a it kind of snaps us out of the frame and forces us to go, like, wait a minute, like let me step out of the frame of the story for a second and look at this as a 20th 21st century person, instead of looking at it like embedded within Roland's point of view.
Yeah.
That's kind of my only explanation at this point, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I like that explanation a lot. This idea that, because the latter half of this book is kind of filled with Jake saying words or phrases that mean nothing to Roland, and there are multiple beats throughout it of him saying something, that Roland is. We kind of get our first little glimpses of the fish out of water Roland stuff that we were delighted by so much in the next book. But there's like there's moments of Jake just having these sayings, and the interesting thing is Jake is like slowly losing his memory of this place
Mm-hmm.
as he is spending more and more time in Midworld, and so a lot of the sayings are just kind of coming out of him, and he can't even explain them. He's just saying them out of habit or pattern, and not even noticing it. And so I do think it does create this really unique thing. You're right that this is a place. This is a place that Jake does not belong. That shouldn't be here. Not just with Roland, but like the world. He doesn't belong there.
Mm-hmm.
He's outside of it, and he's being made sacrificed to it. And it does, I think you're absolutely right, it allows us this different unique perspective. We are so often, or so rarely in Jake's head in this book, almost never, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet like he introduces stuff to us. Like Jake is there are moments in this book where Jake seems almost more equipped to deal with the things they're running into than Roland does. Like when they get under the mountain, Jake is the one that knows what a hand card is, right? He's seen it from the cartoons he's seen. When they get to the subway station, Jake is the one that recognizes that first. He recognizes it as a subway station. He recognizes the all these things. And that is so fascinating because this is Roland's world. Roland, quote unquote, belongs here, and yet Jake is the one kind of the guide through some of the latter part of that stuff, which is, I think, interesting as like perhaps kind of a setup for how much Roland is going to be thrown outside of his comfort zone into new worlds, into new places, in the later books. And man, wouldn't having a person that knows how to navigate that stuff be better for you, Roland? Maybe
Yeah.
throwing Jake down a pit in order to just palaver with the Man in Black, not as great of a calculus as you thought it would be.
Totally. Another moment that I know we talked about the first time we hit it, but I'm going to hit it again really hard here is there's that explicit moment when he feels this urge to say, hey, let's turn it around. I'm going to take the kid. We're going to go back. I'm going to train him to be a gunslinger. And then he and I are going to come after Walter in our own time, and we'll totally kick his ass. And the funny thing is, in the moment, Roland like doesn't really seriously consider this. He almost like sardonically laughs at himself for even thinking such a naive thought.
Yeah.
And the madness that it brings upon us as a rereader specifically is we're like, of course that's what you should have done. Of course you could have easily kicked this guy, because the thing we know about Randall Flagg, the Man in Black, etc., is that he's all trumpery. He's fake. He's smoke and mirrors. Of course you could have kicked his ass way easier if you had a 18, 19, 20-year-old Jake fully trained in the arts of gunslingering after years of adventuring together. You probably also would have Eddie and Susanna too, because again, it was Roland's power to draw them. It wasn't because he caught the Man in Black. It was just innate to him. Catching the Man in Black earned him nothing. Like, and this is something that, again, maybe wasn't clear the first time through, but like is very clear this time. You're just like, he learned a bunch of information that he was going to learn over the next few days anyway.
You are totally right. Especially like, I think this is something I wanted to talk to you about as well on this, because I think this is so apparent on a reread. We know the Man in Black basically has no idea what the fuck's going on. Like, the one advantage the Man in Black has on Roland is that he seems aware that they're stuck in kind of a loop. But like, you go through this wonderful speech that we talked about so much the first time that the Man in Black gives him about, what is power, what is size, like the father of everything is not time but size, the greatest mysteries, and like this flowery, wonderful prose that I think sounds really good in the moment, sounds overwhelming and powerful, and has unlocked the mystery of everything. But like, okay, in retrospect, what the fuck was any of that? It's essentially irrelevant. It's just like, it's smoke and mirrors, as you said. It's like, what is the tower? The tower is size. Like, okay, but like, what do I do with that? Like, from a practical, the practical Roland standpoint of like, I didn't actually gain anything from that except like the only practical stuff he gets from that is the tower.
Yeah.
So there is a tower. Okay, I want to go there. Thank you. Can you please point me in the direction of that tower, please?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think the Man in Black, and I think we maybe even talked about this the first time. The Man in Black says that like the sacrifice of Jake is what opened the magic of allowing him to go through the doors, and like that just smells like bullshit to me. Like, just I don't buy that for a second.
Yeah. I don't know why that would be, right? I think
Yeah.
and like part of it is like there's no, I don't know if I want to like fight the book this hard, but there's no reason to believe anything the Man in Black says. Like,
Yeah.
like Roland is not a wizard. Roland doesn't know the rules. He caught him, but like if he had grabbed Jake at the last second and pulled him along, maybe he would have caught him that way too. Like we don't know just because the Man in Black says like, oh yeah, it had to be this way, and I'm obligated to give you this answer because of the magic. And it's like maybe he just wanted to tell you that. Maybe that's not even true. I mean, the thing about size, I think this is a point I wanted to hit anyway, is, because I don't know. I still don't entirely know what to make of it. It's not really an idea that comes up much.
No.
Directly. It comes up sort of indirectly in the sense that we understand more and more that we're in a multiverse, and that becomes like narratively relevant, not just sort of backdrop. Like Callahan's whole story is
Sure.
this, multiverse spanning story, and the idea of there being infinite Earths and Midworld as this axis, and the tower as the axis of everything, and so forth. I think one thing that I do kind of lean toward now is the Man in Black's framing of all of this is very nihilistic. It's very like Lovecraftian adjacent nihilism, to be like the universe is so vast, so incomprehensibly vast, and we're so incomprehensibly tiny and irrelevant compared to it. How can it even be said to matter that you let the kid fall? Nothing matters because of size. Let size be your excuse for doing whatever you want. Like this seems like a very Randall Flagg sort of justification, where it's just he's one of these ones who saw the universe, with eyes open, and it just burned out his mind, and he's just insane now. That kind of makes sense as an explanation for why this character is the way it is. That makes sense to you at all?
Yeah, it does. It does. Because one of the things on this reread I was kind of trying to do, knowing we were going to have this conversation, is like, I bet there's something in this speech that the Man in Black gives him that unlocks the overarching theme of the series. Like, this is the big climactic moment of this book. This is going to matter in some great way, and I'm going to read this and have some profound reaction to it that unlocks a level of the story that I've never had before. And it's not. It's just, as you said, I think smoke and mirrors is the perfect way of pointing it. Like he is giving Roland information ultimately to manipulate him and force him on the path that he wants him to go on, or that the universe wants him to go on. And then he's doing this performative, like, playing God thing, right? Like he says, "Let there be light" multiple times. Like he is performing as the wise sage that is going to answer all the questions. And as we learn, he doesn't know a goddamn thing. Like he is much a closer foil to Roland in this great game that they're playing, than even he considers, right? So
yeah,
it really puts it in, like, knowing the way he ends and knowing the kind of confidence he goes to his own end with. It really puts everything in this moment in this kind of level of stark relief. I love the thing we learned a little bit later was that, like, the bones that were left there when Roland wakes up and hundreds of years have gone by and he's found by the bones of the Man in Black. It's like this really powerful moment of like, oh shit, this is like some weird wizard dude And then we learned later that he just like placed some bones there. When Roland was sleeping, he just like set up some bones just to fuck with him. Like it is, this whole thing plays differently when you see the full scope of who this guy is, I think.
Yeah, totally. All of the evil in the Dark Tower is kind of like that, where it seems so terrifying until you actually confront it, and then it just melts. But yet, like the deception is what's effective. The fact that Roland buys it. I think one moment that jumped out to me in there was the Man in Black acts like he is the one who has given Roland this vision, but he doesn't even know the contents of the vision. He's kind of trying to fish with Roland, like try to get Roland to tell him what he saw. And it just makes you realize, like, yeah, this guy's it's all trickery.
I kind of, speaking of evil in this book, one of the things I definitely noticed this time that I wanted to talk to you about is kind of going back to that first chapter and Sylvia Pittston. I remember we had this long conversation about this really interesting choice that King makes, where Sylvia Pittston, in a very Kingian fashion, like holds herself out as the priestess of the town. She's the one preaching the gospel. She's preaching the Bible, and she's putting up Roland as the interloper, the Antichrist, when in fact she is allied with the great evil of the world. And there was something that really spoke to me this time as I was reading through that, is she's giving her speech to the town about the interloper and all his evil and his evil ways. And something really spoke to me, like she's talking and she says, when you take a drink, who holds the bottle? The interloper. When you sit down to a faro or a watch me table, who turns the cards? The interloper. When you riot in the flesh of another's body, when you pollute yourself with your solitary hand, to whom do you sell your soul? And I thought that was really interesting, because one of the through lines of this whole King universe in this concept of evil is like, despite the fact that there exists this greater evil out there, it is you yourself and the choices that you make that are inviting them in. So I thought it was a really kind of fitting thing that the person who's actually evil in the town is putting all the bad things that you are doing on that external evil. It's not your fault, right? It's not your, when you take a drink, who holds the bottle? The interloper. When you sit down at the table, who turns the cards? Not you. You individual out there, you're not responsible for anything. This is Satan. This is the Antichrist. This is the evil that exists in the world doing this to you. And that's, first of all, that doesn't really fit in with how sin works in the Bible, like generally. But it also doesn't really fit in how King views evil. And I think that's a perfect kind of like, it helps define the ways in which she's wrong and manipulating people, versus how evil actually functions in this universe.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. Yeah. Just that like one of the reasons why she is such a compelling sort of seductive religious figure is that she sort of absolves them of their sin by telling them, like, well, it's not you. You have no responsibility.
Yeah.
It's all outside of you. And furthermore, it's this guy.
Yeah.
And if you kill him, then everything's going to be great.
Yeah.
Like that's really, really good stuff, actually. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. Love it. Man, what a great book. Is there anything else you specifically wanted to talk about on this reread that we didn't talk about so far?
Just one really incredibly minor detail, and the only reason I mention it is that it slapped me in the face as something that I didn't remember noticing either prior read, which was Hax the cook has electric stoves.
You didn't notice that, really?
I did. Well, maybe I did. You know, it's funny. I'm sitting here and I'm like, I bet if we go back and listen to the episode where we talked about this, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we actually talked about this. but it just went out of my head. And I think like it's an interesting sort of moment to me, because like even having listened to this book twice, I have this very firm picture of what like the castle that Roland lives in and what Gilead looks like. And it's a very fantasy picture. It's a very like medieval picture. Still, Like despite knowing like what this world is like, and then just being reminded like, oh, there's electric stoves, which means there's electricity. There and then also a thing I kept noticing, which again probably noticed before, but it just struck my brain as like a new thing, was like spark lights, mentioning spark lights all the time. And it felt like a new realization, being like, oh, he's talking about electric lights. That's all a spark light is.
Yeah.
It's there's electric lights all in the ballroom and in their, in their halls. They're not using torches, they're using electric lights. They have they have electric stoves, they have electricity in Gilead. And it's just it's just weird to me that my brain just resists seeing and it's because like, your imagination is kind of made of stuff that you've seen before. And it just is very hard for me to like correctly imagine this world the way King obviously wants us to, which is as a kind of a medieval setting, but there's anachronistic elements. Like I just keep like snapping to basically discarding the anachronistic elements and just seeing it as a medieval setting. I just think that's interesting, and that was something that I noticed this time around.
Yeah, no, I like that. That kind of, I think I want to briefly talk to you about Hax and the Hax story that takes place in the middle of this book, because I think we talked about the David and his first sacrifice moment, and I think we talked about how kind of totemic and mythic that moment was when you see the full scope of the Dark Tower. I think it's really interesting to compare it to the other long story flashback in this book, which is the Hax story, because I do think that's no less important to kind of defining who Roland is as a character. But I do think whereas the David metaphor became very, very clear, and because King has Jake define it for us, I think the Hax moment is a little bit, maybe a bit more complex, and like the importance of this story and why we're getting this story in this book. So I'm wondering if you had any kind of additional or new takeaways from his realization around Hax's betrayal and the witnessing of his hanging.
I definitely thought about it a lot more. I don't know if I got to any conclusions. Part of it was like, for some reason, I felt a lot more compelled this time to try to look at the situation from Hax's point of view, and consider whether this might be something justifiable at some stretch. And I want to, kind of frame this correctly, because it's like he's knowingly talking about poisoning, families and children.
Right.
So when I say justifiable, I mean like, I don't really mean like moral. I just mean like, what would push a man to this?
Yeah.
And he is a guy who lives in Gilead. He's like the cook to the literal, gunslinger lord of Gilead. And he is willing to go to this extremity to undermine the rule of, the line of Eld, I guess. We right. Sort of remain vague about how exactly all of this works. But basically, yeah, like the whatever the good man is selling, it's very appealing to even, quote unquote good people like Hax. Like,
yeah.
Like there's nothing about Hax that makes you think like, oh, he's actually just a monster. It's like, no, he's not a monster. He's like a good man who was pushed, perhaps manipulated, but perhaps just pushed by just the terribleness of the situation into thinking that he had to do this. And it really puts a more negative light on Gilead than I was thinking probably the first time around. I think later in the series, I opened my mind to the idea that maybe Gilead was kind of a terrible place, actually.
Yeah.
And we became more aware of like, hey, the way they raise these kids is extremely dehumanizing. And it's no wonder that Roland is this hard case. Basically, just thinking more and more about Hax as a person, not just a narrative cog. That was one thing that struck me.
I think that's great. I mean, I think it is really interesting that like this is kind of a thing that's being layered into this story. So this is a story about Roland recognizing betrayal for the first time and then witnessing death for the first time, right? This is you could have just been a story that is they had this trusted, like, their children kind of playing at gunslinger. They're not quite there yet. They're, being brought up by this hard-assed court to learn these values of honor and respect and loyalty and all these things. And then they experience for the first time a wrinkle in the complexity of the world, in that there are people in the world who don't agree with the things you agree with and are going to directly betray you. And there are consequences for those actions, and those consequences are death. And they witness this whole entire event, and that could have just been the story in and of itself. But yes, the point you're picking up on here, it's not enough that we do that. It's also, we're going to kind of shine a brief window on this idea that perhaps this system is broken, that perhaps there's something wrong here. And I think it's really fascinating that, like, we pick up on that, the reader does. Roland, I think he internalizes it in some way. I think this is part of the constant, like, central war inside Roland, is this great love of things that were lost and destroyed, while also on some level being aware of its brokenness at the same time. And I just think it's such a more fascinating wrinkle on this whole coming of age story, witnessing death, loss of innocence moment, where they both watch a man hang to death for the first time, and have a very visceral reaction to it. But we have to layer that complexity on top of it. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah. There's another connection that it's funny. I keep saying I made for the first time. It's entirely possible that I made this before and just forgot. That being said, I was thinking about the idea of betrayal and what a big deal we make of this. And you just mentioned it, of course. And what does betrayal connect to thematically? And I was like, well, I can't really see it. And then suddenly I realized, like, it's everything in the story. It's just from the other side. It's, if you're the sacrificed, then you are being betrayed by the person sacrificing you. Jake is to Roland as Roland is to Hax in this story. Roland is this big, strong man who is, kind to him and fatherly to him, and embraces him and cares for him, and then turns his back on him and betrays him. And
to poison children, right? The result of his choice here will end in the death of a child, at least.
It's an incomprehensible evil choice both times. And we see Roland's reaction when he's a kid is he goes to tell Stephen about this, and Stephen is like, so, like, why are you why are you tattling, basically?
Yeah.
And he's basically like, I hope it's not because of morality. Because he says, I hope it's not because of some story, because that would be unworthy. It would be unworthy. Basically, he's kind of saying, like, if this is because of Saturday morning cartoons told you that, like, you're supposed to tattle when somebody says they're going to murder children, then that's unworthy. And Roland says, no, he hurt me. And then Roland says, like, that's kind of dark. Stephen says it's kind of dark, kind of low, but that's not unworthy. And it's like, first of all, it's a very interesting moral universe that King is situating us in, but it's very visceral, like you just said. Like, what Roland did to Jake is horrible, and Jake would be justified in feeling exactly the same way toward Roland as Roland feels toward this cook, where it's like, I want to watch him hang. That's going to be awesome. He hurt me. I love the simplicity of that. It really hit me this time around.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's a fantastic point. I love that. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful book.
Yeah.
What a wonderful series. I love this. I love Dark Tower. I'm gonna go on redrawing of the three again. I think.
Yeah, and
We
it's
gotta
such a
read our
weird
book club
book.
book first.
Book club book, yeah.
It is such a weird book. It really is. But in a wonderful way. I mean, like, this is actually, I think, a perfect thing to conclude on, because there's like a part of me that wonders, like, in an alternate universe on another level of the tower, like, what the Dark Tower, what Stephen King, what the world would look like if King decided that the voice that this book was written in is the voice that Stephen King, the author, will continue to write in for the rest of his career.
Mm-hmm.
Like, unquestionably, he'd be less popular. I think, like, the way when Stephen King finds his voice, it's that voice that like propels him to super fame. That he just has a way with that particular voice that just brings people in. It would be less popular. I probably would not love the Dark Tower series as much as I love it now if it still existed with like this, following the template of the tone and voice that this book sets. But I think it would still be a really interesting thing to read. I think it would be really fascinating to see what, like, if you just kind of imagine the other 6 books like this book.
Mm-hmm.
Man, what that would be. That's a fun thought experiment.
Yeah. I think even sometimes he does dip into it, but you're right.
Sure.
I mean, particularly in the drawing of the three, when we're in Roland's perspective, it feels more like the Gunslinger than it does like King's typical prose style. But
Yeah,
I'm not.
fair.
I agree with you that it's not as kind of all in, stylistically downright weird.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like one thing about this book is how floaty the perspective is. I mean, you and I, we like to use the metaphor of the camera when we talk about what the camera is doing. And of course, there's no camera in a novel, but it's like where is our attention being directed?
Mm-hmm.
And the camera in this book is so fluid between past and present and thoughts and feelings and these like epic vistas and rumination and like, not that King doesn't have a fairly active camera, metaphorically, in his normal prose, in his more typical style, but this just feels like willfully dreamlike and hallucinatory for most of the book, really. It's hard to put your finger on. It's always hard to put your finger on style. It's almost by its nature hard to pin down. But yeah, it's something I really love about this book. It makes the book pop in a way that I think paradoxically made me kind of lock into this series even more, because it's like, oh, we're doing something really different and fresh. We're not just getting an hero's journey / coming of age story of a young protagonist for the 15th time. This is something different and weird, and if you're open to that, then you're going to enjoy the Dark Tower. And if you're not open to that, you're probably not going to enjoy the Dark Tower, and you probably shouldn't read it. And I think it's actually a good filter, honestly.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, and one of the absolute delights of this project for me was how quickly you took to this book, because I was, I say this again, I had a reasonable amount of confidence that you were going to ultimately love this series and find a lot of fun things to talk about. I was not 100% confident that like this book would speak to you, and like the first episode I was like, oh, this is working on him exactly the way it should, and it was like, okay, we're good for the series. Like literally, like that's the thought I had to myself as we wrapped up the first episode. Like we're good now. Yeah. Like and again, it's not to say that like that's not to be meant to be a knock against this book in any way, shape, or form. It's just that because it's so different, because it's so unique, it is so, like, if you read a whole bunch, like if you took the exact opposite path that you took for this and you read every single Stephen King novel except for The Dark Tower first and then read this, I I think your reaction to this book would have been like, what the fuck is this? And it's not to say your reaction to this book was not what the fuck is this, but it was more like, what the fuck is this? Like it's just like
yeah.
I mean it's delightful and weird and wonderful and yeah, it's both true to what this series is and also entirely different from every other book in the series.
Yeah, and I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Well said.
All right. One more thing before we go, a brief conversation. I realized we hadn't actually talked about this on the show, and I thought maybe the last bit of the last bit would be the perfect place to do it. Stephen King has announced via Twitter and now Threads that he is back in Midworld. He is working on another book. He says every time he says this, though, he says in Midworld, aka the territories. So I think it's safe to say, Matt, it's a fair assumption here that he's working on another Jack Sawyer book and not necessarily like another Dark Tower novel, the sequel to Black House, essentially. But I did want to get like your opinion here as we wrap this thing up. Like, what should we do here in the Dark Tower series, in this book that's going to happen? What is the correct thing to do? How is the correct way to handle Midworld and the Dark Tower as King moves forward into this? What would you like to see, I guess, is the better question.
Do you mean what you and I should do, or do you mean what Stephen King should do?
No, like what should the book tackle?
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I haven't thought about this question because, I mean, basically, I think if there's something to be said about okay, let me start over, because we just talked about Fairy Tale, which I think was a sort of an appropriate end for the Kingslingers journey in the specific way that we did a lot of, I'll speak for myself. I did a lot of angels dancing on pins, like philosophizing about whether or not this was Midworld. And in the end, my conclusion was like, look, King almost always writes about our world with some fantastical element in it. If he's going to be doing anything fantastical at all, that is. Sometimes it's just totally mundane. And then there's a minority of books where it takes place in another world, or there's a significant element of another world. Yeah. And as far as I'm concerned, those are all Midworld. And that's just my brain's shorthand. I'm not whether or not that's literally true, it's almost irrelevant. And then Fairy Tale kind of fit that, where it's like he has something to say and he wants to say it in a way that is highly fantastical and metaphorical, and kind of let himself go. And maybe there's just certain ideas that he likes to explore where the way that he finds most comfortable to explore those ideas is through a setting that is more fantastical.
Sure.
More maybe themes or characters or so forth, where it's like he wants to say something, he wants to talk about some idea, and it makes the most sense for this to be a Midworld story rather than a, writer who lives in New England stumbles upon a magic pillow that is evil story, which is the other kind of story that he writes. I don't know. That's not an answer to your question at all, I realize, but it's like for me, I think the reason why I went on this big tangent is like, for me, I think that he starts out with like what he wants to talk about, and then the nature of the story follows. So he must have had, if he's going back to the territory / Midworld, he must have had some brainwave of some notion of a story he wants to write, and the way to tell that story, it kind of has to be in Midworld, or it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying here, and I think I agree with you. I do wonder, like, how if there's going to be some attempt, like this could very well be. The guy's not getting any younger. This could very well be like the last time he writes about Midworld. It's very possible. And first, I think we should say, like, he's been very candid. Like, nothing might come of this, right? He might start writing the story and then realize halfway through, this isn't really working, and just throw it away.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if there's a pull in some way to tie, because yeah, I mean, like he used the midworld is the territories thing very loosely in the Talisman, and a little bit more specifically in Black House. But like, I wonder if there's a way of like using this book and tying the Dark Tower series and the Talisman series together in this neat bow of like the last time we're going to midworld. Like, are we going to see like what is kind of the time period of this book, right? Like where in the timeline are we when we're quote unquote in midworld? Is this are we going to get a glimpse of what midworld looks like post Roland's journey to the tower? Like, what would that even be? I don't like, how would that even work? You know, there's a lot of unknown and interesting questions here, and I am curious how he's going to do it. And I like, it's not that I'm not saying I don't have confidence in his ability to do it, but I think this is a kind of a prickly possible route to go through. And I wonder if there's going to be a temptation to pull in recognizable Dark Tower characters and settings and things. And I part of me hopes that it's not that. Part of me hopes that is just, we continue to play fast and loose with this territories, this midworld thing, and Jack is going to have an adventure through the territories, because as we remember at the end of Black House, he cannot come back. If he comes back to Earth, he dies. And so who knows? I agree with you. Like, there's a reason why he was pulled into this. There's a reason why he felt the song of the turtle to head back to this book series, especially after Peter Straub has passed away. And it's going to be interesting, but I really don't know what to make of it myself.
Yeah, I mean, it could even be something that thematically deals with the idea of the death of your, co-writing partner of one half of the universe has died.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Like, he could be approaching it with a very, direct kind of, in some sense, a tribute to Peter Straub. I don't know. It's just a thought, but it's an enjoyable. That's really interesting.
I like that idea. Yeah, no, I like that idea. I kind of, part of me is going to be a little disappointed if that's not part of it. But we'll see. We don't even know if it's happening, when it's happening. We don't know. We do know it was announced yesterday, Matt, that the next King book is going to be another Holly Gibney story. So he's really in love with those. It's coming out in early spring of next year. So you really if you want to read all these new King books, you're really going to have to spend some time with the Bill Hodges and Holly books, I think.
So interesting.
All right. Well, I think this is it for real this time, right? Like for reals. Like, we're not, once again, we're not tricking you twice. This is it. We thought it'd be fun. Like, honestly, I think we had this idea months and months and months ago of like, when we finally end the podcast, we have to surprise them one final return to the Dark Tower and to the Gunslinger as like a fun little surprise treat at the end of things. So I'm so glad we actually got to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we will probably do one-off episodes over the months and years. If you and I happen to read like if I happen to read a Stephen King book on my own, I'll probably tell you. I imagine it'll come up, and then we'll probably talk about it. Stuff like that. I'm just saying, like, it's doubtful that this would be the last episode for reals on the feed. But this is the last planned episode as of now. Yes.
Correct. Yeah. And I think those book episodes, if and when they do happen, would probably more closely resemble this type of thing, and less the type of episodes we would have, historically, when we're spending a lot of time really, really closely discussing the books. Which, I mean, hopefully you like this stuff. I think it's similar to our conversations. It's just a little less focused, a little more loose. But I enjoy it. So yeah, I mean, we're definitely going to be like I said, we're going to have to do an episode on Salem's Lot eventually. When if the Talisman series with the Stranger Things guys ever comes out, probably going to have to do that. If that Fairy Tale series ever comes out, probably going to have to do that, right? So there's opportunities for us to cover adaptations of things we've covered on the show, which I think will be a lot more reasonable of a time commitment for us than reading an entire novel for one episode. But yeah, I mean, Matt will hopefully continue to explore the King universe, and we'll continue to talk about it when we can.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, this is it. This is truly it. I promise. We're done. I do want to say here at the end, like, thank you for last week, everyone. Like, the outpouring of not just in the voicemails we got, but people who didn't feel comfortable leaving a voicemail and sent emails and messages on Reddit, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Threads. I joined Threads, Matt. There's a Duke Media Threads account now because that's where all the cool people are going. And just the outpouring of support and love from y'all has been absolutely overwhelming. I'm going to try to respond to every one of those emails. It's going to take me a little bit, but we got a lot of them. And I just wanted to say once again, thank you, everyone. We're so glad you enjoyed this little thing we did. And we hope that you're going to stick around with us and follow us into the next project.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Once again, one last time, that next project is Flanagan's Wake. It is a separate podcast on a separate feed. There's been a little confusion about that. We are going to post the episodes here, probably the first two here, just to make sure y'all are getting the memo that we've started that up. But it will be its separate own thing, and we want you guys to follow along with it. Make sure you follow us at Flanagan's Wake 19 on Twitter. Also, Doof Media on Instagram and Threads now, to make sure you don't miss any news around that.
Yeah. Remember, you can reach us via kingslingerspod@gmail.com, and over on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And of course, regardless of whether you want to talk about Kingslingers or Mike Flanagan or anything else, the subreddit at reddit.com/r/doofmedia will always be the hub for that.
Yeah, and if you can always get merch too. Reminder that Christmas orders need to be in by the 10th. There's a bunch of great merch out there, including some Christmas ornaments. There's also, Jody like sneakily threw some Flanagan's Wake stuff out there recently too. Ooh. So there are sweaters. I'm wearing my Flanagan's Wake hoodie right now. I immediately bought one. There's coffee mugs and sweaters, the usual stuff, and we will continue to create more merch as we go, but check it out for sure. That's dukemedia.myshopify.com.
Yeah. And if you like our shows and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. There will continue to be bonus content over there regardless of the transition that we're doing with all this stuff.
Yeah, a From podcast is coming very, very soon. We kind of had to put it on pause to make sure we had time to do this special surprise episode, but it'll be coming. It'll be coming very soon.
That's right.
And of course, please continue to share the podcast, and especially, if you've been sharing Kingslingers and that's over now, you can share the Doofcast. You can share the book club. Those are two things we are going to continue to do as well. This week on the Doofcast, we're talking about Alien Romulus, the new Alien movie that came out this year. We have some things to say about that, and we're going to continue to do book club. So I think there's plenty of ways to share Doof Media and the work we're going to continue to do. If you would help us out by doing that, that would be really wonderful.
That's right.
All right, folks. We will see you hopefully in January over on Flanagan's Wake or on the Doofcast or on book club, or just see you around on Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, yada, yada, yada. We'll see you. We'll be seeing you. Thanks again for this wonderful experience. It changed our lives, and it will never be the same for it. So thank you for being a big part of it, and we'll see you around.
See ya.
Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.